The dust had not yet settled on Pauline Crawford's grave when Jasper Crawford made himself a promise quiet, iron-forged and absolute, that he would never again let a woman's name settle soft and permanent inside his chest the way hers had. That was 4 years ago, in the autumn of 1878, when the Texas Panhandle had smelled of dry grass and coming cold, and he had stood at a mound of fresh-turned earth with his hat in both hands and nothing whatsoever left to say. Pauline had been 26 years old, taken by a fever that came swift and stayed only 3 days before it finished its work entirely. 3 days. Jasper had barely had time to send for the doctor in Amarillo before there was no longer any need for a doctor at all. He had been 28 then. He was 32 now, and he ran a cattle operation of modest but respectable size out of a spread called the Flat Rock Ranch, situated 12 miles south of the town of Calhoun, Texas, which in the year 1882 was a growing, sun-cracked, wind-scoured place of perhaps 400 souls, 2 saloons, a general store, a livery, a church of the Methodist persuasion, and a sheriff named Walt Briggs who was decent enough, but occasionally too fond of rye whiskey, to be entirely reliable on a Friday night. Jasper had built Flat Rock from almost nothing. He had come to that stretch of Texas with Pauline in the first year of their marriage, with a borrowed wagon, $40 in silver coin, and the kind of bright-eyed stubborn certainty that only very young people and very foolish people carry with them into hard country. As it turned out, he had not been foolish. He had been capable, methodical, and in Pauline's words, absurdly patient for a man with a temper like yours, Jasper Crawford. She had always said his name in full when she was teasing him. He had loved that about her so fiercely it had been almost embarrassing. 4 years later, the ranch had grown to include 4 full-time ranch hands, a broad-shouldered man from Georgia named Deke Holloway who served as his foreman, a quiet young Mexican vaquero named Tomás Reyes, who could rope anything that moved, a red-haired Irishman called Finn McCarthy who could fix any fence or wheel or gate in God's creation, and a solidly built older man named Clarence who had come up from San Antonio and never explained much about his past, which Jasper respected. Together the 5 of them managed a herd of nearly 300 head, and the operation ran as smoothly as anything in that rough country could be said to run, which was to say imperfectly but persistently. Jasper's life in 1882 had a particular shape to it. He rose before dawn. He worked until dark. He ate supper at a table he had made himself in a house he had built himself, and he sat in a chair by the fire on cool evenings and read whatever books he could get his hands on, because Pauline had insisted on books and he had inherited the habit from her. He went to town on the first Saturday of each month to collect supplies and settle accounts. He did not go to dances. He did not go to church, though he had nothing specifically against God, and he nodded respectfully to Pastor Hale whenever they passed on the street. He did not drink to excess. He did not gamble beyond a hand of cards now and then at Deke's insistence, and he did not speak to women beyond what courtesy and commerce required, not because he was bitter, or not entirely because of that, but because he had discovered, after Pauline died, that grief had a geography to it, and that he had mapped his grief so carefully, lived inside its borders so precisely, that to venture outside of them felt like standing at the edge of something he could not see the bottom of. It was easier to stay where he was. His ranch hands knew better than to say much about it. Deke had made one attempt in the second year to suggest that Jasper might consider attending the summer dance in Calhoun, and the look Jasper had given him in response had been so quietly final that Deke had never made the attempt again. The others had followed suit. The subject of Jasper Crawford and the possibility of female company was, on Flat Rock Ranch, entirely and permanently closed. Which was why, when Pauline Lawson's wagon broke its rear axle on the road that ran past the south fence of his property on a blazing Wednesday afternoon in June of 1882, and Jasper happened to be riding his fence line, and happened to hear the crack of the wood and the sharp alarmed cry that followed it, and he rode over and found her there. The last thing in the world he expected to feel was the particular kind of interested attention that sat up inside him before he could instruct it to lie back down. She was standing beside the listing wagon with her hands on her hips, and an expression on her face that was less distress and more the specific, concentrated annoyance of a woman who had already solved several problems today, and was deeply displeased to find another one waiting for her. She had dark brown hair pinned up under a faded blue bonnet, a face that had been touched by the sun and was not the poorer for it, and dark eyes that swung to him when he rode up with the direct, appraising quality of someone who was accustomed to making quick judgments and being right about them. "That axle is done," she said, before he could speak. "Yes, ma'am," Jasper agreed, pulling up on his horse a deep-chested blue roan named Bishop and looking at the wagon. The rear left wheel had tilted almost to the ground. Whatever she was carrying, boxes, crates, a trunk, what looked like household goods, was sliding slowly and ominously toward the low side. "I have several things in there that cannot be dropped," she continued. The tone was even, practical, containing something that might have been a request underneath its surface, but was not willing to let it show entirely. Jasper swung down from Bishop without being asked. He walked around to the back of the wagon and assessed what was happening. The axle had sheared clean, which meant the wheel could not simply be jacked back into place. It would need replacement, which meant a trip to town, which in this heat on this road meant the better part of a day. "You traveling alone?" he asked, not looking at her, still examining the axle. "I am." He straightened up and looked at her properly then, which was the first mistake he made, because looking at her properly revealed several things simultaneously. That she was perhaps 26 or 27 years old, that her expression held an equal measure of worry and determination, and that she was clearly not from this part of the country, or at least not from any part of it where she had people who would come looking for her if she stood on the side of this road too long. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Calhoun, I am taking a position there." She paused. "Teaching," he nodded. That explained the boxes, or some of them. There were the square corners of what looked like books inside one of the crates. It explained the traveling alone, too, in a partial way. A woman taking a teaching position was, in his experience, usually a woman operating under the particular independence that came from having made her own arrangements for her own future without reference to anyone else's opinion on the subject. "My ranch is back that way," he said, gesturing south. "I can take you into Calhoun with your things, and I can get a man out here to watch the wagon, and in the morning we can bring the parts to fix it." She looked at him with those direct dark eyes. "That is very kind," she said, and the way she said it was neither soft nor suspicious but measured, the way a person speaks when they are deciding whether or not to trust someone and are not yet sure. "It is not kindness so much as practical," he said. "You cannot stay on this road. The sun will get you before nightfall." Something moved in her expression that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "That is also true," she said. He helped her stabilize the wagon as best they could and transferred the most important items: a trunk and the 2 crates of books, and a flat wooden box that she handled with particular care to the back of his horse, which Bishop bore with the dignified sufferance of a horse that had hauled more improbable loads. He tied the rest to his saddle in a fashion that would hold for the ride back to the ranch, and he sent Finn McCarthy back to watch the wagon with instructions to sleep on it if he had to, and then he walked Bishop back toward the ranch with the woman at his side. They walked in silence for a stretch. The land was flat and gold and enormous around them, shimmering with late afternoon heat, the sky a deep improbable blue overhead. A hawk was circling somewhere behind them. "Is it far?" she asked. "Half a mile," he said. More silence. She walked well, with a long, easy stride that did not suggest complaint. He found himself noticing this with a kind of involuntary interest that he then deliberately turned away from, which was when he made his second mistake, because in deliberately turning his attention away from her, he somehow turned it toward her name instead. He found himself wondering what it was, in the absent, incurious way one wonders what the weather will be tomorrow, or what time it is, and then he realized that the wondering was not absent or incurious at all, and that he was about to ask a woman her name for the first time since Alina died, and he had made his second mistake before he even recognized he was making it. "What is your name?" he heard himself say it. The words were out before the instinct to hold them back could catch up, as though some part of him had simply skipped past the usual restraints entirely and gone straight to the asking, and now there was nothing to do but wait. She glanced at him. The faint not-quite smile came back. "Pauline," she said, "Pauline Lawson." A pause, something passed through him that was warm and unwelcome and real. "Pauline Lawson," she said again clearly, as though she had noticed something in his face and was answering whatever it was. He said nothing for a moment. The ranch house came into view ahead, small and square and solid against the flat line of the horizon, the windmill turning slowly beside it. "Jasper Crawford," he said at last, because it seemed fair. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "The man at the general store in the last town told me about the ranches along this road," she explained. "He said if I had any trouble past the 3rd-mile marker I might find help at Flat Rock." She paused. "He said the man who ran it was dependable." "He was generous," Jasper said. "He seemed sincere," Pauline said. They walked the last portion of the distance without further words, but the silence was different now, broken open by names and the small bare fact of an exchange made. She knew his. He knew hers. And the knowing sat between them as they walked like a stone dropped into still water, the rings of it moving outward in all directions whether either of them intended it or not. Deke Holloway met them in the yard with the particular expression he wore when he was trying to keep his face neutral, and was not entirely succeeding. He was a large man, Deke, with a jaw like a fence post, and a general aspect of someone who had seen most things and been surprised by very few of them. But he had never in 4 years seen Jasper Crawford walk across the yard beside a woman, and the effort of keeping that fact from showing on his face was clearly costing him. "Miss Lawson's wagon axle broke on the South Road," Jasper said, with a deliberateness that dared commentary. "She is headed to Calhoun to take up a teaching position. I told her we could see her there this evening and get her things squared away." "Yes, sir," Deke said. And if there was any extra significance in his voice on those 2 words, Jasper decided not to hear it. Pauline was taken to wash up, and Tamaz brought water, and Jasper went to the barn and stood with his hand on Bishop's neck for a little while, looking at nothing in particular. He was not accustomed to the particular feeling currently occupying the space behind his ribs. It was not entirely pleasant. It felt like something shifting, like settling timbers in a structure that had been stationary for a long time. He told himself it was nothing. She was a woman in need of practical assistance, and he had provided it, as he would have for any traveler on that road. The name was a reflex. The question had been automatic, manners and practicality combined. It meant nothing beyond that. He almost believed it. Supper at Flat Rock was a plain but sincere affair Deke cooked on Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and he did it reliably, producing a beef stew this evening that was better than its ingredients had any right to be. Pauline sat at the table without the slightest suggestion of discomfort in company of 4 ranch hands and their employer, and she ate with the straightforward appetite of someone who had been traveling since before sunrise, and she answered questions when they were asked and asked her own when they were not. And by the end of the meal Finn McCarthy had told her 3 stories about fence posts that in retrospect all said the same thing, and Tamaz had mentioned his mother in Chihuahua. And Clarence had said more words at one sitting than Jasper had heard from him in a calendar year. Jasper watched all of this from his end of the table. He ate his stew. He answered when she spoke to him directly. He did not allow himself to do anything else. But he noticed, he could not help noticing, that she listened to Tamaz with the same focused attention she gave to Deke, that she laughed at Finn's 3rd fence post story with what appeared to be genuine amusement rather than politeness. and that when Clarence made his rare and careful contribution to the conversation, she turned to him with the kind of patient consideration that indicated she understood that some people spoke slowly, not because they had little to say, but because they were choosing each word with unusual care. She was, Jasper thought, the sort of person who saw people. He was not certain he had been that before Alina. He was not certain he was it now, but he recognized it when he saw it. After supper he drove her into Calhoun himself, Deke riding alongside for propriety's sake, which Jasper appreciated without needing to say so. The drive took just under an hour, the road running north through the flat dark country with the stars enormous overhead and the lantern at the front of the wagon throwing a small yellow circle of light ahead of them. She was to stay at the boarding house run by a woman named Marta Hensley, which was respectable, and the school board had arranged for her things to be held there, until she could set up her classroom in the schoolhouse at the east end of town. The boarding house was a wide two-story building with a lamp burning in the lower window, and when they pulled up, Marta Hensley came out in her nightcap looking prepared to be cross until she saw Pauline, at which point her expression shifted to something that was firmly maternal and busy. Jasper helped carry the trunk inside. He set the crates of books in the front room. He set the flat wooden box carefully on the hall table. Pauline stood in the doorway as he came back out. "Thank you, Mr. Crawford," she said. The light from the boarding house doorway was warm and gold behind her, for everything. "Someone would have come along," he said. "Perhaps," she said, "but I am glad it was you." He put his hat back on. He walked back to the wagon. He did not let himself look at her again. On the drive home, Deke said nothing for a full 30 minutes, which was a personal record. Then he said, "She seems like a fine woman." "Yes," Jasper said. Another silence. "A good thing you happened to be riding that fence line today," Deke offered. "Yes," Jasper said again. Deke left it alone after that, which was either wisdom or self-preservation, and they drove the rest of the way home in the dark with the stars blazing above them and the windmill turning slow and silver when they came back into the yard. Jasper lay in his bed that night and stared at the ceiling. He thought about the broken axle and the walk across the flat shimmering land, and the way she had said her name twice, not because he had asked twice, but because of something she had seen in his face when she said it the first time, something that he had not put there intentionally and had not known was there until she answered it. He thought about that for longer than he intended. Then he made himself stop thinking about it, which took longer still. In the morning he was in the south pasture before the sun was fully up, doing work that did not particularly need to be done at that exact moment but which kept his hands occupied, and that was the main requirement. The axle was fixed by mid-morning. Finn and Tamaz brought the parts from Calhoun and did the repair in the shade of the road's single cottonwood tree, and by noon the wagon was squared up and waiting, which was all that was needed, since Pauline Lawson's things were already in the boarding house, and there was no particular reason for the wagon to go anywhere further until she arranged for it herself. Jasper told himself he would not go into Calhoun that Saturday. His supply run could wait another week. He went anyway, because Deke mentioned that the feed supplier had an order that needed signing before the end of the week, and that was a legitimate practical necessity that had nothing to do with anything else. He signed the feed order at Pearson's Supply. He settled an account at the hardware store. He was standing outside the general store, which was called Abernathy's, with a list in his hand and a perfectly businesslike purpose, when Pauline Lawson came out of it with a paper bag of flour and nearly walked into him. She looked up. She adjusted her grip on the flour. He smiled, a real one this time, not the adjacent to a smile he had seen on the road. "Mr. Crawford," she said. "Miss Lawson," he said. They stood on the wooden sidewalk outside Abernathy's general store in the morning heat of a Saturday in Calhoun, Texas, and there was that same feeling from the road, the feeling of water rings moving outward from a dropped stone, except now it was stronger. "Your axle is repaired," he said. "My men left it on the south road. I know. I have already been out to it. I drove it in this morning." She tilted the flour bag. I appreciate you sending them. Practical, he said. Something in her expression said she remembered his use of that word from before and found it either amusing or interesting or possibly both. Of course, she said. A pause came in, the easy kind, not the uncomfortable kind. Have you settled in? He asked. Mostly. The school board has been very welcoming. The schoolhouse needs some work on the south wall, but I have been promised that will be addressed before September. She paused. Have you been in Calhoun long, Mr. Crawford? You seem to know it well. 4 years, he said. She nodded. She waited, which was the thing about her he was beginning to notice. She did not rush. She gave things room to arrive or not arrive, which was a quality he did not usually associate with someone her age and was not sure he associated with himself at all. My wife and I came here in 1878, he said. The words surprised him slightly. He had not planned them. She passed that autumn. A pause. Fever. The change in Pauline's face was not pity. He would not have been able to tolerate pity, and she seemed to somehow understand that, because what came over her expression was something quieter and more serious. An acknowledgement, a recognition, the kind of look that said, I understand that this is not something you put down lightly. I am sorry, she said, simply, without decoration. Thank you, he said, equally simply. The Saturday street moved around them, horses and wagons and people calling to one another, and they stood in the noise of it, having exchanged something that felt like more than the words they had used. And then Pauline said she needed to get her flour back before the heat got worse, and he said he still had accounts to settle, and they parted ways with a politeness that was nothing like the blankness of two strangers and everything like the particular care of two people who have just agreed, without speaking it aloud, to treat something fragile with their full attention. Jasper went into Abernathy's and bought his supplies. On the way home he let himself admit, to himself and no one else, that the feeling behind his ribs had not diminished since Wednesday but had in fact grown, and that this was a problem he was going to need to think about carefully, and probably for a long time. He thought about it for 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, the following things happened on Flat Rock Ranch. Deke fixed the water trough in the east paddock. Tamaz roped a steer that had broken through the fence 3 days running without being caught. Finn discovered a rot in the barn's north corner post and replaced it in a single afternoon with the cheerful efficiency of a man who has found his calling. And Clarence shot a rattlesnake in the feed room with a calm economy of motion that nobody spoke of afterward but all appreciated. Jasper managed the operation with his usual precision, and worked the hours he always worked, and said approximately the same amount of words per day as he always said. But in the evenings, when he sat by the fire with his book, he sometimes read the same paragraph 3 times. On the 14th day, he went back to Calhoun with the pretext of collecting a delivery of wire that he had ordered 3 weeks prior and which had finally arrived. The wire was real. The delivery was real. He collected it at the hardware store without any deviation from routine. On the way back through town, he passed the schoolhouse, which had its front door open because it was a hot morning, and the south wall repair was apparently underway, given the sounds of hammering coming from the outside of the building. Pauline was standing in the yard with a piece of chalk in her hand, writing something on a slate board she had propped against the fence, squinting at it in the light. She looked up when he stopped the wagon. They are fixing the wall today, she said, by way of explanation for the hammering. I can hear that, he said. She looked at the slate board, tilted her head, erased something, wrote it again. I am trying to decide how to arrange the primers, she said, not particularly to him but not excluding him either. The children who will come in September will be different ages. Some will have had schooling before, others not at all. How many children? 11 enrolled so far. The board thinks there may be as many as 15 by September. She set the chalk down on the fence rail. Have you children of your own, Mr. Crawford? No, he said. She nodded, not pressing it, and he was grateful for that. I was a teacher in Virginia before I came west, she said. My family is there, Charlottesville, a pause, but I wanted something different, something that felt less already decided. He understood that, he thought. He understood it more than he might have expected to. "The West is not short on undecided things," he said. She laughed, a real one, clear and easy. It startled him slightly, the way a sudden bird startles you not because it is frightening but because it is unexpectedly alive. He found that he wanted to make her laugh again immediately, and he held that wanting at arm's length and looked at it from a careful distance. "No," she agreed, "it is not." He stayed 20 minutes. He told himself 10 and stayed 20, and when he left he was aware that the time had passed faster than 10 minutes usually did, which was either a comfort or a complication. He could not decide which. July moved through the Texas Panhandle like something on its way somewhere else, hot and fast and indifferent, and somehow Jasper Crawford found himself in Calhoun more often than once per month. There was always a reason. The wire order had needed additional hardware, and then there was the matter of the grain supply, and then Finn needed a specific tool from the blacksmith that could not be collected by anyone else. And once there was actually nothing at all, and Jasper went anyway and told no one he had gone, and came back with a book from the small lending library that Marta Hensley kept in the front room of her boarding house. He and Pauline had established the habit, without ever naming it as such, of meeting at a natural collision of coincidences that were becoming less coincidental with each passing week. They talked outside Abernathy's, or in the shade of the livery, or once, most memorably sitting on the bench outside the boarding house, while a summer rainstorm came in low from the west and turned the street to mud, and Jasper sat with his hat in his hands, not willing to leave in the rain, and Pauline sat beside him watching the rain with the expression of a person who finds weather genuinely interesting. She told him about her family. A father who was a professor, a mother who had died when Pauline was 12, 2 younger brothers who still lived in Charlottesville and wrote to her faithfully if not frequently. She had come west the previous autumn, she said, and spent the winter and spring in a town east of Amarillo teaching at a school there before the position in Calhoun opened up, which was larger and more established and offered somewhat more predictable employment. He told her things, too. Not many at once and not quickly but steadily, the way ground thaws slowly, then more, then more. He told her about Flat Rock before it was Flat Rock, when it was a bare stretch of caliche and stubbornness. He told her about the first winter, when he and Alina had lived in a structure that was more of a suggestion of a house than an actual one. He said Alina's name, which he rarely did, and it came out steady, which surprised him. Pauline did not make a thing of it when he mentioned Alina. She listened with her full attention, and she asked one careful question, and then she moved on with the same grace she brought to everything. And the result was that Jasper felt, for the first time in 4 years, that he had spoken about Alina to someone who was neither walking on glass around the subject nor minimizing it, but simply receiving it as part of the full and actual account of who he was. By the end of July, he was aware that he had a significant problem, or not a problem exactly, but a thing that required him to make a decision, because not making a decision was itself a kind of decision, and he knew it. He was in the habit now of arriving in Calhoun on a Friday morning instead of a Saturday, because Friday was the morning Pauline walked from the boarding house to the schoolhouse to prepare for the following week, and the schoolhouse was on the same end of town as the hardware store. He had not said any of this to himself plainly, but he had arranged it, and the arranging was its own admission. She knew he was doing it. He was fairly certain she knew. She had the kind of perception that missed very little, and she had the kind of honesty that did not pretend to miss things she had noticed. But she had not said anything about it, and he had not said anything about it, and they moved around the knowledge of it with the particular elaborate courtesy of 2 people who have both been hurt before and have learned to be careful, because she had been hurt before. He knew that much, not from anything she had said directly, but from the way she held certain things, a slight reserve around anything too immediate, a habit of keeping future plans hypothetical. Something had happened, somewhere in Virginia or in the east of Texas, and whatever it was had taught her the same geography of caution that he had been living in for 4 years. On the first Friday of August, Jasper came to Calhoun with no pretext whatsoever for being there. He did not invent one. He simply went, and he tied Bishop to the rail outside the schoolhouse, and he went in and found Pauline on her hands and knees arranging primers in the low bookcase along the west wall, and he stood in the doorway and said, "Miss Lawson," and she sat back on her heels and looked up at him with an expression that had something waiting in it, something that had been waiting for a while and was ready to stop being patient about it. "Mr. Crawford," she said. "Jasper," he said. He had not planned this either. It was simply the most direct thing available, and he said it, and then, "I would like to take you to supper, tonight if you are willing. Here in Calhoun at the Mercer Hotel dining room, which is respectable and serves a decent roast." She looked at him for a long moment. The late morning light came in through the schoolhouse windows and lay in warm rectangles across the swept floor. "I am willing," she said, and that was that, or that was the beginning of it. The Mercer Hotel dining room was indeed respectable and indeed served a decent roast, and it was also the only establishment in Calhoun where a man could take a woman to supper without it being accompanied by either piano music of a questionable nature or the smell of whiskey, which suited Jasper fine. They sat across from one another at a table with a white cloth and 2 candles, which was more formal than anything Jasper had subjected himself to in years, and he was not precisely comfortable, but he was present in a way he had not been in a long time, aware of himself, aware of her, aware of the specific and unrepeatable quality of the evening around them. They talked about everything and nothing books primarily, because she had discovered his borrowed copy of Ivanhoe in his coat pocket during the rainstorm conversation, and that had led to a discussion of Walter Scott that had lasted half a mile on the road to the ranch, and now picked up again, as if it had never been set down. She had opinions about literature that were crisp and certain and occasionally combative, and he found that he had corresponding opinions that he had been keeping to himself for years because there had been no one to have the argument with, and the arguing was genuinely pleasurable, particularly when she was wrong, which she was about Scott and knew it and declined to concede it. They also talked about the territory, about Texas, what it was and what it was becoming, about the towns growing up on the Panhandle and the cattle drives moving north, about the railroad coming down from the north, about what would change and what probably would not. Pauline had a particular interest in what would happen to the children of the territory as it settled the schooling question, the question of what was taught and to whom, and whether children from different backgrounds received different consideration. "The Mexican children," she said, meaning the children of families like Tomaz's family, working ranches and farms throughout the region. "I have been told some of the school board members feel they ought to be educated separately. I intend to make it clear from the beginning that in my schoolroom every child sits together." He looked at her across the candle-lit table. "That may cause difficulty," he said. Not arguing the point, just naming it. "I am aware," she said. "I intend to cause it." He felt something shift again behind his ribs, more substantial than the previous shifts. It was, he recognized, the feeling of admiration of a very specific kind, the kind that does not condescend, that does not romanticize, but simply looks at a person fully and thinks, "Yes." He walked her back to the boarding house afterward, because the night was clear and cool after the day's heat, and there was no particular reason to hurry. They walked slowly through the quiet town, the stars visible above the buildings, someone's dog barking twice in a yard and then going silent. At the gate of the boarding house she stopped and turned to look at him. "Thank you, Jasper," she said. His name in her mouth felt like something he would need to think about later. "Thank you, Pauline," he said. She went inside. He stood at the gate for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, looking at the closed door, and then he walked to the livery where Bishop was stabled, and he rode home through the dark and the enormous stars, and when he came back to Flat Rock and put Bishop in his stall and went to the house, Deke was sitting on the porch in the dark with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, clearly waiting. "You were in town," Deke said. "Yes," Jasper said. A pause. "Until 9 o'clock, Deke said. "I had supper at the Mercer," Jasper said. Deke said nothing for a moment. Then, "Good, just that." Jasper went inside before either of them could make more of it than that one word, but he heard Deke exhale on the porch in a way that contained considerable satisfaction. August was kinder than July in Calhoun. The heat broke slightly in the second week, the evenings going cool and blue earlier than expected, and the schoolhouse was ready by the 15th of the month. The south wall repaired and painted, the primers arranged, and the arithmetic books unpacked, and the benches set in their rows. Jasper knew this because Pauline told him, and she told him in the course of the 5 additional evenings they spent together over the course of August, some of them at the Mercer and some of them walking, and once at a church picnic that Pauline attended and that Jasper appeared at without planning to. And there she introduced him to Pastor Hale's wife and to 2 families from the north end of town, and he stood in the church meadow in the late afternoon sun and felt, with a strange and careful wonder, something like a person who has been standing still a very long time and has taken one step forward. On one of these evenings, a warm Tuesday in the 3rd week of August, sitting on the bench outside the boarding house after a walk along the north road, Pauline said, quietly and without particular preamble, "There was a man in Virginia before I came west." He looked at her. "He had a great deal of money and a great deal of certainty about what my life ought to look like," she said. "He was not unkind, he was simply very sure, and the things he was sure about left very little room." She paused. "When I told him I wanted to teach, to actually go somewhere and teach, not simply sit in a parlor and feel educated, he told me it was a phase." Another pause. "I chose Texas." Jasper was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think Texas was the better choice." She looked at him, and the smile came fully this time, unguarded and staid. "I think so too," she said. He told her about Alina that evening, more than he had before, not everything, but the real parts, the parts that mattered. About how they had come west together and what that had meant, about the house and the land and the particular quality of 3 years of marriage to someone who was completely themselves with you. About the 3 days of fever. About the grave on the slight rise east of the house where he had planted grass seed every spring because Alina had said once in passing that bare dirt looked lonely. Pauline listened to all of it with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes steady on him, and when he finished she said, "She sounds like she was remarkable." "She was," he said. "She would have liked you." The words arrived without planning, and after they landed he sat with them and found they were true. Pauline was quiet for a moment. "What makes you say that?" "Because she was honest," he said, "and she did not put up with things that deserved not to be put up with. And she thought the Panhandle was worth all the difficulty it handed her, which showed she had both courage and poor judgment." A pause. "She would have found all 3 of those things in common with you." Pauline looked at him for a long moment. Then she said softly, "Jasper." "Yes," he said. "I am trying to be careful," she said. "I think you understand that." "I do," he said. "I am too." "Good," she said. "I think it is worthwhile, though, whatever this is, I think it is worthwhile." A pause. "I just want you to know that I think that." He said nothing for a moment. He looked at the dark road and the sky above it and the first stars appearing in the blue dark. "So do I," he said. September arrived with the school year, and Pauline's classroom filled with 11 children on the first day and 14 by the second week, the extra 3 belonging to families who had moved into the territory just before fall. She had, predictably, taken no interest in the school board member who had suggested the Mexican children be taught separately, and had instead arranged the benches so that 6-year-old Rosa Reyes, Tomaz's niece, as it turned out, sat between the lawyer's daughter from the north end of town and the blacksmith's youngest boy, and the lesson on the first day had been about letters, which were the same letters in anyone's language. The school board member had come to express his displeasure to Pauline about this arrangement. Jasper heard about this secondhand, from Marta Hensley, who told Deke, who told him with the expression of someone delivering news they expect to be well received. The relevant part of the account was that Pauline had listened to the school board members' displeasure with polite, patient, absolute attention, and then she had thanked him for stopping by and shown him the door and gone back to her primers. The school board member had, upon reflection, decided to let the matter stand, possibly because Pauline's expression during the conversation had made it clear that no possible outcome of continuing the argument could be to his advantage. Jasper had laughed when Deke told him this. Genuinely, fully, the kind of laugh that is not performed and not polite, but simply arrives because something is purely satisfying. Deke had stared at him for a moment with an expression of such open and astonished delight that Jasper had told him to get back to work, and Deke had gone, grinning. The thing between him and Pauline had not been named yet, but it had a shape and a weight and a direction, and by October it had a pattern of the kind that only forms between two people who have found a specific gravity in each other and have stopped, mostly, pretending otherwise. He went to Calhoun on Fridays. She saved the Friday evenings. They had supper at the Mercer, or at the boarding house, where Marta Hensley occasionally added a setting with the proud and transparent innocence of a woman who has decided something, and is waiting for the people involved to catch up. On the third Friday of October, after a supper at the Mercer during which they argued productively about whether the new territorial government would make things better or worse for the smallholder and came to no conclusion but enjoyed the argument thoroughly, Jasper walked her back to the boarding house gate and then said, before she could go in, "I would like to ask you something." She turned back. He had thought about this. He had thought about it from several angles and in several different forms, and in the end the most accurate version was also the simplest. "I would like this to be what it clearly is," he said, "if you are willing. I am not rushing anything, and I know we have both been careful for reasons that made sense, and I am not suggesting anything except that we stop pretending we are only friends who have supper occasionally." Pauline looked at him in the dark outside the gate. The lamplight from the boarding house window was behind her. Somewhere down the street someone was playing a fiddle, badly, with great enthusiasm. "Are you courting me, Jasper Crawford?" she said. "Yes," he said. "I suppose that is exactly what I am doing." A pause. "I was wondering when you were going to get to it," she said. He blinked. She was smiling the full, unguarded smile, and there was something in it that was relief and warmth and a particular kind of teasing that only comes from someone who has been paying close enough attention to earn the right to it. He found that he was smiling back, which was something he had not done, reflexively, in the company of another person in a very long time. "Duly noted," he said. She laughed. The fiddle down the street launched into something that had possibly been a waltz in a previous life. The October night was cold and clear and enormous above them, and Pauline Lawson stood at the boarding house gate with her eyes bright in the lamplight. And Jasper Crawford felt, with a certainty he had not felt in 4 years, that life was not finished with him, and that he was not, in fact, finished with it. Courtship in Calhoun, Texas, in the autumn of 1882, operated under its own specific set of conventions that were partly formal and partly practical and partly determined by the fact that everyone in a town of 400 knew everything about everyone within approximately 48 hours of it happening. The result was that Jasper and Pauline's courtship became a matter of local knowledge with a speed that would have been disconcerting if either of them had been the type to be disconcerted by it. And since neither of them were, they simply accepted that Marta Hensley would smile archly at Jasper whenever he came to call, and that Deke would no longer pretend any neutrality whatsoever about the Friday trips to town. They went to the October harvest social together, Pauline's first social event of the kind in Calhoun, and Jasper's first dance of any description in 4 years. He was not, he had warned her, a dancer of any accomplishment. "I will take my chances," she said. He danced with her twice, which was not artful but was sincere, and on the second dance, a slow one, the fiddle player having apparently found his footing somewhere around 9 in the evening, she looked up at him and said quietly, "This is good, Jasper." "Yes," he said. "I want you to know that I am not being careful anymore," she said. "Or not in the same way. I am being deliberate now. There is a difference." He understood the difference. He had felt it himself, the shift from self-protection to intention, from holding back to moving forward with full knowledge. "Me too," he said. She rested her forehead briefly against his shoulder. Just a moment, a gesture of something uncomplicated and true. And then the song ended, and they stepped apart with the particular dignity of people who are also going to have to face the town over breakfast. November brought cold in earnest, the kind of flat iron cold of the Panhandle that comes in from the north and settles down with no intention of moving. And the cattle needed extra attention, and the work on the ranch doubled in the mornings. And Jasper's Friday trips to Calhoun became less regular by necessity. But he sent letters, which was something he had not done for anyone except suppliers in 4 years, and the letters came back regular, warm, occasionally funny, always honest. Pauline had a particular quality in her writing that matched her quality in speech, which was to say directness softened by care, and Jasper found himself reading her letters at the kitchen table in the morning before anyone else was up, which was an entirely new habit, and one he saw no reason to be ashamed of. One of her letters told him that little Rosa Reyes had learned to write her own name, and had done it with such pride that she had stood on her bench to show the whole class, and that the whole class had applauded, including the school board member's son, who had apparently not inherited his father's opinions. Another letter told him that the south wall was leaking in the first real rain, and that the school board had promised a repair, but she had her doubts. A third letter was mostly about Ivanhoe, which she had reread and was now more willing to partly concede his point on, though she used the word partly with such precision that he recognized it as a concession of the minimum possible ground. He wrote back about the cattle, about the cold, about Finn's ongoing war with a particular stretch of fence that had developed, as Finn put it, a personality and a bad attitude. He wrote about what the ranch looked like in November, the flat gold grass going brown, and the sky going white, and the windmill turning against it. He wrote once about Aliner's grave, which he had cleared of leaves in the first week of November as he always did, and he wrote it plainly because Pauline had given him the thing of being able to say Aliner's name plainly, and that was worth acknowledging. December arrived, and with it the particular social energy of a small western town at Christmas, which was partly religious and partly not and entirely enthusiastic. The church hosted a gathering, and the school had a recital, Pauline's 14 students performing a program of songs and recitations before their families in the schoolroom, which was lit for the evening with every lamp Marta Hensley could spare. And Jasper came to the recital and sat in the back and watched Pauline stand at the front of the room with a calm authority that was entirely natural to her, conducting the proceedings with the ease of someone who has found precisely the right place for themselves. Rosa Reyes recited a short verse in English, and then, with a nervous glance at Pauline that received a small, encouraging nod in return, a second verse in Spanish, which made her parents, sitting 3 rows back, hold each other's hands, and made something tighten warmly in Jasper's chest. Afterward, in the cold outside the schoolhouse with the parents collecting their children and the lamps going out behind them, Pauline stood beside him in her coat with her breath making small clouds in the air. "You came," she said. "I told you I would," he said. "You did." A pause. "It went well." "Rosa's verse was the best part," he said. "She worked on it for 3 weeks," Pauline said, with the quiet satisfaction of a person whose investment has returned more than expected. He turned to look at her. She was looking at the last families leaving, the small figures of children with their parents' hands, the lanterns bobbing away down the street. Her expression was peaceful and open, and for a moment he looked at her and thought, with a clarity that he did not try to moderate or qualify or be careful about, that he loved this woman. that it was not approaching love or the beginning of it or the possibility of it, but the real thing which had arrived without announcement and had been there, he suspected, for some time. He did not say it, not yet, not out here in the December cold with the town moving around them, but he let himself know it, which was its own kind of step. He said, "Pauline." She turned to look at him. "Come out to the ranch for Christmas," he said, "with Deke and the others, Marta too if she will come, just dinner. I would like to have Christmas at Flat Rock again." He had not had Christmas at the ranch since a leaner. He had gone to Calhoun or simply not marked the day particularly. He had not said any of this, but from the look on Pauline's face she had understood it anyway. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." Christmas came, and Pauline came with it, arriving at Flat Rock in the Hensley wagon with Marta Hensley, and to Jasper's mild surprise, Tomaz's sister and her husband and Rosa Reyes, who had apparently been considered part of the plan by everyone except Jasper, and whose presence was entirely welcome. The ranch house was warm. Finn had cut a pine branch and hung it over the door, which was as close to decoration as the men of Flat Rock had managed, and Deke had been cooking since before dawn with a seriousness of purpose that had kept everyone else out of the kitchen. The table was extended with a board laid over sawhorses and covered with a cloth, and set with everything Jasper owned that could be called tableware, which was eclectic but sufficient. They ate for 2 hours. Rosa Reyes sat next to Jasper and told him in careful English about everything she had learned in school, and he listened to every word with the full attention he gave important things, which seemed to satisfy her. Marta Hensley and Deke had a conversation about cooking that became competitive in a way that was clearly enjoyable to both of them. Finn told another fence post story that was, against all probability, genuinely funny. Tomaz's sister and her husband talked with Clarence about San Antonio, which was apparently a place they both knew, and Clarence said more words in an hour than he had in the previous 3 months. Pauline sat across from Jasper at the extended table, and every time he looked at her, she was attending to something or someone around her, with that quality of full seeing that he had first noticed on the road back from the broken wagon. And once she looked up and caught him looking at her, and held his gaze for a moment with an expression that did not pretend anything, that was simply warm and clear and real. After supper, when the afternoon light was going gold and flat outside, and the children were settled near the fire, and the adults were in various states of coffee and contentment, Jasper said quietly to Pauline, "Walk with me a moment." They went out the back, past the barn to the small rise east of the house where Eleanor's grave was. The grass seed he had planted there over 4 years had taken well, and the rise was green in summer and was now dry winter gold and still, with a wooden marker he had made himself and maintained carefully. He stood beside the grave for a moment. Pauline stood beside him, not speaking, not needing to. "I wanted to come here today," he said. "I wanted it to be here today." A pause. "I did not think 4 years ago that I would stand here and feel whole. I did not expect that." He felt Pauline's hand find his there in the winter afternoon, quiet and certain. "The things we do not expect," she said softly, "are sometimes the most honest ones." He turned to look at her. The sky behind her was the particular pale winter blue of the Panhandle, enormous and clear and going cool at its edges where the sun was moving west. Her eyes were steady on his. "Pauline," he said, and her name in his mouth felt the way it always felt now, like something settled and right. "I love you." The words arrived without drama, without the elaborate construction he might once have imagined they would require. They were simply true, and he said them, and the truth of them was the whole of the moment. She was quiet for just a breath, not hesitating, he thought, but receiving. "I love you, Jasper," she said, equally plainly, equally true. He brought her hand up and held it in both of his there beside Eleanor's grave in the winter afternoon, and there was nothing complicated about it. Eleanor was real and gone and part of who he was, and Pauline was real and present and part of who he was becoming, and the two things existed in him without contradiction, because love, he thought, was not a finite quantity that ran out when it was used, but something that changed shape and found new ground. They walked back to the house together. The sounds of the Christmas supper reached them before they got to the door: Rose's voice, Finn's laugh, the clink of dishes, Marta Hensley directing someone to put that down carefully, for goodness sake. Jasper held the door open for Pauline, and she went in ahead of him into the warmth of it, and he stood in the doorway a moment looking at the scene inside his house. This house he had built and maintained alone for 4 years, and the scene was populated now, lit up and noisy and alive, and it was the most correct thing he had seen in a very long time. January 1883 came in cold and clear, and Jasper Crawford made a trip to Abernathy's General Store in Calhoun on a Tuesday morning that had nothing to do with supplies. He spoke for approximately 20 minutes with Mr. Abernathy's wife, who also happened to be the person in Calhoun who kept a small selection of jewelry in a glass case at the back of the store, a secondary business that was not well advertised but generally known. He left with a small box in his coat pocket and the calm certainty of a man who has not rushed and is not running, but is simply walking in the right direction. He waited another 2 weeks, not from doubt but from a sense that the moment should be the right one, and that the right one would be legible when it arrived. It arrived on a Friday evening in the 3rd week of January after supper at the Mercer, walking back through the cold, quiet street with Pauline's arm through his and the town around them still and dark and lit here and there by the warm rectangles of windows. He stopped walking. She stopped too. He turned to face her. The street was empty. The stars were the Panhandle stars, extraordinary and numerous, and the cold air was perfectly still. He said her name, Pauline Lawson. She looked at him with those direct dark eyes, and in them was that quality of readiness, not surprise, because she had seen him. All along she had seen him, but readiness, the kind that has been waiting with full knowledge for something that is not a surprise but is still entirely a gift. He took the small box from his pocket. He opened it. Inside was a ring, simple, honest, a slender band with a small set stone that caught the starlight. "I am asking you to marry me," he said, "if you will. I am asking because I love you, and because I think the rest of my life wants to be in your direction, and because I believe we could build something together that is worth building." A pause. "And also because it would have to involve a permanent library on Flat Rock Ranch, and I am prepared to construct one." She looked at the ring. Then she looked at him, and her face was all the way open, no reserve, no careful distance, nothing held back. "Yes," she said. "Jasper, yes." He put the ring on her finger there in the cold street under the Panhandle stars. And then, because he was a man who did not usually do things without purpose, and this was a purpose that had been arriving for months, he kissed her careful, then not careful at all, then honest, and she kissed him back with the same straightforward completeness that she brought to everything she decided to do fully. "A library," she said when they stepped back. "A proper one," he said. "With Walter Scott in it," she said. "And a note beside the Scott indicating that your position on Ivanhoe remains incorrect," he said. She laughed clear and full in the cold night street, their breath mixing in the still air. They were married on the 14th of March, 1883, in Pastor Hale's church, on a morning that was cold but bright, with the kind of winter-end light that comes in low and clear and makes everything look new. The church held the whole town, more or less, which was not the quiet affair Jasper had vaguely imagined but was, he discovered, exactly right. Deke stood beside him with the expression of someone who has been waiting a very long time for something, and is made entirely content by its arrival. Finn McCarthy had polished his boots until they were a credit to the profession of boot polishing. Tamaz and his sister and her husband were in the 3rd pew, and Rosa Reyes was in the front row in a dress that had clearly been ironed with great care, her dark eyes wide and intent with the seriousness appropriate to a significant occasion. Pauline came down the aisle in a dress of deep blue, not white, which she had said was not her color, and not, she suspected, the honest choice for a woman of 27 who had lived enough to know what she was choosing, and she walked toward Jasper with her chin up and her eyes steady and the smile, the full one, already on her face before she even reached him. Pastor Hale spoke the words. They said the words that needed saying. Jasper put a second ring on Pauline's finger, next to the engagement ring, and she looked at him over the small distance between them with an expression that was everything she had ever communicated in every careful, and then uncautious conversation over the months past, and it was enough to fill a lifetime, he thought. He kissed his bride in front of the town of Calhoun, and the town of Calhoun was thoroughly satisfied about it. The spring of 1883 was good to Flat Rock Ranch in most of the ways that matter. The calving went better than the previous year, the grass came back strong after the winter, and the fence that Finn had been fighting for 8 months finally behaved itself, apparently having accepted defeat. There was a new room added to the house in April, and May framed and raised with the help of Deke and Tamaz and Clarence and 2 neighbors from the north pasture who came over with their tools and stayed for dinner. And this room was for the library, which Jasper had promised and delivered. He built the shelves himself, the way he had built the table and the chairs, with the patient precision of a man who understands that the things you make with your own hands hold a different kind of permanence than the things you acquire. Pauline filled the shelves over the course of the spring, unpacking the crates of books from the boarding house with the methodical pleasure of someone restoring order to something beloved, and the flat wooden box, which turned out to contain her mother's small collection of poetry, preserved and transported west across 2,000 miles, was given the shelf nearest the window, in the best light. She continued teaching through the spring and into the summer, because the school board had been in no hurry to see her go, and she had been in no hurry to leave. The classroom had grown to 16 students by May, and Rosa Reyes was reading 2 grades ahead of her age by June, which Pauline announced at supper one evening with the tone of someone announcing a significant victory, which it was. Jasper drove her to school on the mornings he could, and rode back to the ranch for the day's work, and came back in the afternoons when the work allowed, and sometimes when it did not particularly allow, but he managed anyway. He was not a man who had previously understood the specific quality of having someone to come home to, or having someone to come home, but he understood it now with the vivid precision of a late and hard-earned lesson, and he did not take it for granted for a single day. They had their arguments, because they were both people with opinions, and the opinions were not always the same, and neither of them was inclined to pretend otherwise. They argued about Ivanhoe again, and about the best method of waterproofing the new room's corner, and once at some length about whether it was a reasonable thing for Jasper to ride out alone in a lightning storm to check on the herd, which Pauline correctly identified as not reasonable, and which Jasper correctly understood he was not going to win. After that argument, he admitted, with a directness she appreciated, that he had been wrong, and she admitted, with equal directness, that she might have expressed her point more calmly, and they came to the kind of equilibrium that only 2 people who respect each other's right to be entirely themselves can reach. Not a compromise in which both sides give up something, but a real arriving at the same place by different roads. He told her things he had not told anyone. About the first year after Aliner's death, the white silent quality of it, the mornings of waking to the particular specific weight of absence. About the exact moment he had made the promise not to learn another woman's name, standing at Aliner's grave in the first cold of autumn. She listened to all of it as she always listened to everything, and when he was done she put her hand on his face and said, "I am glad you asked mine." "So am I," he said, "though I could not have stopped myself if I had tried." "I know," she said. "I could see that. It was the first thing I liked about you. That I had no self-control," he said. "That something in you was still willing," she said. In the late summer of 1883, Pauline told him she was pregnant. She told him on a morning in August, sitting at the kitchen table in the early light with her coffee cup in her hands, and he was standing by the stove with his back to her when she said it, and he turned around and looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," she said to the question he had not asked yet. He came to the table and sat down across from her and took her hands in his. "Are you well?" he said. "Perfectly," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but perfectly." He held her hands and looked at her in the early morning light of the kitchen he had built, in the house that was already fuller than it had been, and he felt something in him that was so much larger than his ability to name it that he did not try. He simply held her hands and looked at her. "Pauline," he said. "I know," she said. "A boy was born on the 4th of March, 1884, almost exactly a year after their wedding day, which amused Pastor Hale when Jasper reported it. He was born in the upstairs bedroom at Flat Rock Ranch, with Marta Hensley and the doctor from Calhoun present and Deke pacing the yard below, with an expression of profound agitation that he later, categorically, denied having had. The boy was healthy and loud, and had his father's serious dark eyes and his mother's very direct way of looking at things, which was immediately apparent even in the first days, when he regarded the ceiling above the cradle with the concentrated appraisal of someone conducting a thorough assessment. They named him Thomas Crawford, after no one in particular and for no reason except that it was a solid, honest name that wore well, and that was sufficient. The spring that followed Thomas's birth was the fullest one Flat Rock had known. The cattle operation expanding, 2 new ranch hands hired to manage the increase, the library room given additional shelves to accommodate the books that kept arriving from Eastern suppliers, and a small kitchen garden that Pauline had planned out over the winter and planted in April with the methodical enthusiasm she brought to new projects. Rosa Reyes came out to the ranch on Saturday afternoons through the spring and summer, ostensibly to help with the garden but primarily, Jasper suspected, to spend time around the baby and to conduct her ongoing educational conversations with Pauline, who had not stopped being her teacher simply because the school year had ended. The school board had hired a new teacher for the following year, a young man from Missouri named Carver who was earnest and capable if not yet seasoned, and Pauline had spent several afternoons at the schoolhouse in the summer introducing him to the classroom and the students, and with particular emphasis, to her system, for ensuring that every child in the room received the same quality of attention regardless of their family's background or the language spoken in their home. Carver had listened with the attentiveness of a man who understood that he was learning from someone who knew considerably more than he did, and Jasper had approved of him for exactly that quality when he met him. Pauline was not teaching formally that year, with Thomas new and the ranch requiring attention, but she was not idle. She had begun writing something, in the evenings after Thomas was asleep, in a composition book at the kitchen table, and when Jasper asked her about it, she said it was notes on teaching methods for use in frontier schools, which she intended to send to a publications board in the East that had expressed interest. He read a portion of what she had written one evening with her permission, and found that it was clear and authoritative and practically brilliant, which surprised him not at all. "This should be published," he said. "That is the intent," she said, with the calm assurance of someone who has already decided this, and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. It was published, as it turned out, in the spring of 1885, in a journal of educational practice based in Cincinnati, which arrived at Flat Rock Ranch in May with Pauline's name on its cover in print, and which Jasper put on the shelf in the library with the kind of deliberate placement that indicated it was going nowhere. By the summer of 1885, Thomas was walking and talking, and had the very specific combination of his parents' characters that made him both deeply interested in everything and deeply determined about most things, and the combination was endearing in small doses and exhausting in sustained ones. He particularly liked the horses, which Jasper had suspected would happen, and had at 14 months developed a relationship with Bishop that the old roan bore with an indulgence well beyond his usual temperament. Deke, who was a man without children, and without particular designs on acquiring any, but who had apparently been waiting without knowing it for someone small to teach things to, had become Thomas's second attachment at the ranch, and the sight of Deke Holloway carrying a 14-month-old on his broad shoulders while explaining the function of the water trough was a frequent one in the Flat Rock yard, and never failed to produce from Pauline the specific quiet warmth of someone watching something true happen. In August of 1885, on a morning that was dry and golden and absolutely ordinary, Pauline came to find Jasper in the barn where he was working on a bridle. She stood in the barn door with the morning behind her and a particular expression on her face that he recognized. "Again," he said. "Yes," she said. "When?" he said. "March, I think," she said. He set down the bridle and looked at her in the dim, warm air of the barn. Outside, Thomas could be heard conducting a demanding conversation with Bishop through the paddock fence. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Completely. Are you?" He looked at his wife in the barn doorway of the ranch he had built in the Panhandle of Texas, with their son's voice outside and the horses moving in their stalls and the book-filled house at his back, and all of it real, all of it alive, all of it present. "Yes," he said. "Completely." He crossed the barn to her, and she came in a step, and he held her there in the morning light for a long moment, with the sounds of the ranch around them and the smell of hay and horses and the particular warmth of her against him. And he thought of a road in June 1882 and a woman standing beside a broken wagon with her hands on her hips, and a name that had come out of him before he could stop it, and the way she had said it twice. He thought of Alina, too, because she was part of the man standing here. And the man standing here was a good man, he thought, or at least a man who was trying. And Alina had helped make him that, and Pauline was helping continue it. And some things did not cancel each other out but simply added. The second child was born in late February of 1886, a girl this time, with Pauline's dark eyes and Jasper's stubbornly self-assured expression, which was slightly unusual in a newborn but entirely characteristic, as it turned out, of the person she was going to become. They named her Alina, which Jasper had not suggested, and Pauline had, one evening when they were discussing names in the library with Thomas asleep and the fire going and the composition book closed on the table. "Alina," she had said, "if you are willing." He had been quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "Yes," he said, "I am." And so the baby was Alina Crawford, and she grew with a particular fierce quality from the beginning. And the grave on the eastern rise had its name echoed in the house in a way that was not a shadow but a continuation, a thread of something running forward. By the winter of 1886, Flat Rock Ranch was a full and established place. The cattle operation supported 5 full-time ranch hands now. The library had 2 full walls of shelves, and the kitchen garden had been expanded to a proper kitchen garden by Pauline with help from Tomas's sister. The school in Calhoun under Carver had grown to 22 students, and Pauline's published piece on teaching methods had led to a correspondence with an educator in Albuquerque, and subsequently a second publication. This one on the education of mixed-background students in territorial schools, which was more formally controversial and more genuinely important. In the evenings, Jasper and Pauline sat in the library after the children were in bed, Thomas 2 years old and loud about everything, and Alina 6 months and intent about everything. And they read or wrote or talked in the way of 2 people who have found a home in each other's company that does not require performance. He had long since finished being careful in the way he had been careful, and she had long since finished the reserve that had come from Virginia and from the certainty of a man who had not left room. They were simply themselves together, which was the most complicated thing to arrive at and the simplest thing once you were there. Deke Holloway got married in November of 1886 to Marta Hensley's widowed cousin, who had come to Calhoun in September and been introduced at a Sunday gathering. The wedding was at Flat Rock Ranch, which was the largest and most reliably comfortable private space available for such things by that point, and Jasper stood as Deke's witness with a satisfaction that was personal and complete. And Pauline had organized the supper that followed with the same efficiency she brought to everything she organized. And the result was the best evening the ranch had seen since Christmas 1882, which remained the gold standard. Spring of 1887 brought good rain, which the Panhandle did not always see, and the grass came in green and deep, and the cattle thrived, and the kitchen garden outdid itself, and Pauline started a third composition book, and Thomas, at 3, learned to ride a horse, a small docile pony named Bread, acquired from a neighbor, which Thomas immediately renamed General despite Jasper's careful explanation of how naming things worked. Eleanor at 1 year old had 4 teeth, a determined crawl, and a settled opinion about what she would and would not accept, which was a narrower range than most. And Jasper sat on the floor of the front room many evenings playing the kind of purposeless stacking and unstacking games that are deeply important to 1-year-olds, and went along with all of it with the full unself-conscious engagement of a man who is exactly where he ought to be. On an evening in that spring, with the children in bed and the house quiet and the windows open to the evening air and the windmill turning slowly in the yard, Jasper sat in the library and looked at his wife across the table where she was writing, and she looked up and found him looking and returned it. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He considered it. "About a road," he said, "and a broken axle." "June of 1882, she said. "I was riding the south fence," he said. "I almost did not that day. I almost stayed in the north pasture." "I know," she said. "I think about that sometimes." "Do you?" "The particular accident of it," she said, "that it was that road, that fence line that day." He was quiet a moment. Outside, the windmill turned. Bishop's shape was just visible in the paddock from the window. "I asked your name," he said, before I could stop myself. "I know," she said. "I could see it happen." "What did you see?" She set down her pen and thought about it with the seriousness she gave honest questions. "I saw a man who had been somewhere else for a long time," she said, "and who was at that particular moment present here, looking at me." A pause. "And who had not intended to be, which made it more true, not less." He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp on the table was warm and yellow between them, the books behind her on the shelves, the flat box of her mother's poetry at the window in the last of the evening light. "Pauline Lawson," he said. She smiled. "Jasper Crawford." "You told me your name twice," he said. "I did," she said. "Why?" he asked, though he thought he knew. She thought about it again in her honest way. "Because the first time you looked like a man hearing something he had not expected to hear," she said. "And I thought, whatever that is, it deserves a second chance to settle." He thought that was one of the most accurate descriptions of that moment he could have imagined. "Did it?" he asked. "Settle?" "Completely," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand. The ranch was quiet around them, the hands in their bunkhouse, the cattle in the dark fields, the children breathing in their rooms, the graves on the eastern rise quiet under the spring stars, the road to Calhoun 12 miles north under the same sky, all of it held inside the same enormous stillness of the Texas night. He had not asked any woman her name since his wife died. He had asked this one before he could stop himself, and she had told him twice, and the rest of it, the summer evenings and the autumn courting and the winter letters and the March wedding and the boy with serious eyes and the girl named Eleanor and the library with its 2 full walls, and the life that had come back into being around him, with the particular thoroughness of something that intended to stay, all of it had come from that. From a name said twice on a June road. From a question he had not planned and could not take back and would not have taken back for anything in the world. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him with those dark eyes. "For what?" "For telling me twice," he said. She squeezed his hand. Outside, the windmill turned and the stars were enormous, and everything that needed to be closed was closed, and everything that needed to be open was open. And Jasper Crawford and Pauline Lawson Crawford sat in the lamplight of the library they had built together in the house he had built alone on the flat gold land of the Texas Panhandle, and it was completely and entirely enough. More than enough. It was everything.